Europe's security window is closing faster than anyone wants to admit.
I was speaking to NATO yesterday, and the timeline that came out to me was like 20 months, right?
If the clock is this tight, what's the bigger picture?
The world is getting less safe, not more.
Here's the uncomfortable answer most investors won't tell you.
The short answer is defense writ large performs better, and investments in defense perform better when they're defense first or defense only. Why is that? They produce better capabilities, and as a result of doing that, they do better, and as such produce better returns.
But building well means learning the right lessons.
We need to take the right lessons from Ukraine, not all of the lessons.
So how do you actually build right fast? It's a feedback flywheel.
Pairing those with real-time iteration and feedback from the end user, in this case, the warfighter, and almost on that commercial software type model.
And the people who'll actually do it.
In terms of the real change in technology, I would argue that that's going to happen in startup land.
What happens when Europe's defense startups stop chasing dual use and build purely for the battlefield first? Find out in this episode of EUVC, where frontier meets funding.
Before we start the show, a quick note. If you're building or running a fund, you know it takes the right partners. At EUVC, we only work with sponsors we truly believe should be part of your tech stack. Please do take a moment to hear about them. And if you do, reach out, mention EUVC. It's the best way you can support what we do. Thank you so much. First up, ACE Alternatives. Every fund manager needs clean operations behind the scenes. From fund admin to tax and compliance, ACE handles it all across VC, PE, private debt, and real assets. They're trusted by some of the best investors in the world, and if you want peace of mind and a scale-ready back office, ACE should be part of your stack. Finding deals and managing your portfolio is at the heart of running a fund. Synaptic helps you discover startups before others do, and Portfolio IQ keeps your portfolio data sharp and ready for LPs. Together, they're essential tools for modern fund managers. When it comes to legal, you need a team that truly knows venture. Haynes Boone supports LPs, GPs, startups, and scale-ups across the full fund lifecycle. Smart managers make Haynes Boone part of their stack. We have two at EUVC. Tech Barbecue. Oh my God, who doesn't love barbecue? Europe's startup scene meets the loudest, friendliest family reunion ever at Tech Barbecue. From Nordic founders to global VCs, this is where ideas catch fire and relationships get real. If you're building or backing in Europe, Tech Barbecue is where you want to show up. And hey, if you've got a big fun announcement coming up, want to hit the headlines, or just want to tell your story out, do reach out to us because we'd love to help. And we've got some killer partners to help you get in the right media places. They've helped us land Bloomberg, CNBC, Financial Times, Forbes, and many more for the EUVC Summit, and we'd love to do the same for you.
This was their finest hour.
Tear down this wall.
It's more than just an alliance. This is a union of values.
Let's start acting.
This show is not investment advice, and the hosts of this episode may be invested in the funds and companies featured.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the EUVC podcast. Today, we're diving into a pioneering move in the European VC space, the hard launch of Archangel, Europe's only defense-first venture fund, co-led by Nicholas Nelson and Daniel Carew. Nicholas is at the helm of Archangel as general partner, bringing deep VC, government, and strategic policy experience. He's built on a long career on offset ventures, strategy consulting, and even deployments in Afghanistan. Now leading this fund from Estonia to back next-gen defense tech across Europe. Daniel comes from deep tech-focused investing and has held stellar senior roles at Seraphim Space Fund and a series of other deep tech funds, bringing a strong background in early stage deep tech and strategic defense edge investing. And I can tell you all, I am looking so much forward to this episode because both Daniel and Nicholas have proven incredibly good speakers every time I've interfaced with them. So guys, welcome to the podcast.
No, thanks for having us,
Thanks.
Andreas.
I called it a hard launch of a defense fund, defense first fund. Tell the audience, what do I mean by that? Why do I call it a hard launch?
No, I think it's an apropos term here, Andreas. So when we first started incubating Archangel and decided to launch it, as you and I talked about on the previous pod, I was of the mind, I'm going to do this myself and with a partner, if it was only the right partner. And there were, let's say I count on only two fingers that folks in Europe I really wanted to partner with on something like this, that saw the world in a similar way, that brought a complementary skill set in there. And Daniel, without a doubt, was on that two-person shortlist. And I was lucky enough, over the years we've known each other, to have a chance to get to know him, understand his thesis, how he approaches the market. And so as that conversation evolved after our launch, especially in June at Latitude 59, I asked Daniel to come on board earlier this spring, and I was delighted he accepted. And so I'm looking forward to investing with not just a past co-investor, but also a good friend.
Daniel, share a few words why you thought that this was the right move for you.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've known Nick for quite a while. I mean, he and I guess, first met when we were in NATO circles. I think we both gravitate to doing things that we think matters. And Nick, he was doing space when I was doing space, and then we've done a number of co-investments together. But what's really interesting is we approach it from a different sides, right? I approach it from this DARPA type methodology. So I've grown up watching DARPA. I spent literally from when I could read, age of 7, I've been reading about defense tech and the newest stuff that DARPA, which is, for those who don't know, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency in the US. They're the guys that have done, the internet, GPS, self-driving cars, etc. And for me, it was like, I've always been, super, motivated to do things that matter and find tech that's going to matter. And defense has always been like that. But I always felt like I had a gap. And that gap is sort of the really immediate stuff. My brother's in the army, but I never felt like I had this, really great network to be able to understand, like, what's like super topical right now. I'm really good at sort of 4+ years, the strategic things, but Nick is just amazing at the early stuff. Like, he just has connectivity and a way of kind of talking and networking to get the real answers into what we need right now. I don't think there's anyone else really that can do that. That, like, honestly just sort of fits the two ways that we approach investments.
And guys, you're doing me the honors of allowing me to be part of the people that are launching your fund together with you, at least from a messaging perspective. So tell me, why EUVC?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Andres. And you and I have known each other for a number of years at this point, which seems to have gone by fast. From the time I really wanted to launch a venture fund, it was always on this thesis of defense first and defense only. As part of that, though, it also comes to a broader conversation, I think, about one call it European sovereignty, or also just building up a European ecosystem. And when I was first going down this garden path, years ago now, you and I had those initial conversations back when it was the EUVC Slack channel and your first few podcasts were coming in. And I viewed them as almost two sides of the same coin about you have to have a functioning ecosystem before you can have a functioning specialist ecosystem. And that's one of the biggest drivers. And when we look at this, we talk about Archangel as a platform, and we'll get into, I'm sure, more of that later. But we really view having, pardon the colloquialism, but allies and partners in there. And to be quite frank, you've been great, allies and partners and friends since when I started conceiving this. And throughout this process, I think not only are you good for the ecosystem, but I've been starting a lot of the most really important conversations across private capital and tech writ large in Europe, but from an actually unbiased perspective with like a truly positive agenda for Europe. And I feel like really that's hand in glove, if I may say so. So that's why I want to do this. And when we were talking about, okay, hey, we need to do a formal launch now that Daniel's coming on board full time, I could think of no other outlet I wanted to go work with.
Yeah, I'd really emphasize that, Andreas. Like, I think defense is, a tricky topic, and we're, starting to see this sort of change in European society. And I've always felt you have a very thoughtful way of approaching that, right? Which I think is exactly what's needed.
Thank you, guys. I could say all I try and do is be the best I can for our ecosystem. So thank you. It means a lot when you say this. Guys, you are defense first. You're not dual use. You're not anything of the sort. Why defense first? Why is it so paramount to you that is what you're doing?
Up front, the short answer is defense writ large performs better, and investments in defense perform better when they're defense first or defense only. Why is that? They produce better capabilities, and as a result of doing that, they do better, and as such produce better returns. And trying to do dual use from inception results in different product development pathways, some cases even conflicting pathways, fundamentally two different go-to-market pathways or expansion paths, and effectively different sales motions. I do not believe at early stage you can be a dual use company, because you will end up doing both less well than you would have had you focused on one or the other. Now, if you want to talk about, hey, a late stage company moving into defense, or a defense company, say like Palantir has done over its course, moving from defense and intelligence into commercial, then sure, let's have that conversation. But for early stage, not only do I have the evidence to back up it produces better returns, but also at the end of the day, it produces better capabilities for war fighters and for the broader ecosystem for European militaries and governments. And I know firsthand, Daniel's done the same thing when you look at space, because I think we can, as you and I've talked about before, the US defense market is a bit ahead, and that can be a good, I guess, stalking horse, so to speak, for where European defense tech goes. But the other one is one that Daniel and I both come through, which is also the space ecosystem, because it followed a very similar path with the quote unquote new space. And I know Daniel has a lot of good lessons learned from some of his investments there, starting out with his time at Seraphin.
Yeah, no, just emphasize on what Nick's saying there, right? I think there's a couple things. I mean, he and I are both closely plugged into MODs, and in particular, I was speaking to NATO yesterday, and the timeline that came out to me was like 20 months, right? We're thinking this stuff is going to happen perhaps within 20 months. So there's no there's no way of expanding the time, right? We're very short on time in terms of what might happen within Europe. And, it's always been true that, advanced technology happens in defense first. Trying to ignore that is just, creating complications like Nick said. And we just need to sort of grasp that and say we're approaching that from that point of view. And that makes it a lot simpler, right? The dual use approach, a lot of complexity kind of falls away in terms of, is a weapon, is it not a weapon? The guys in defense don't look at it that way, right? They just need a thing to do something, whether it's a part of a system or not a system. You can get yourself tied up into kind of rhetorical or theoretical type complexity and conversations that don't really need to be there. At the end of the day, it's about sort of whose technology wins. And, in our opinion, that happens first in defense. So that's why we've gone with this approach.
I got to double click on one thing when we talk defense first, and that is a bit of the problems that comes with being defense first. Sometimes it can be really nice for a venture fund that what they invest in doesn't have to be labeled war machines because of LPAs, because of LPAs of your LPs, so one layer above, because of even what the startups need to be branded as. What is your take here? Why do you think, and do you think that this is really a problem or not?
I mean, first and foremost, like as I said at the very, very beginning, I don't think I could do defense first without Nick. You need real sort of connectivity into the end user and the customer, and I think he has that, right? And then I think what's unique is that we can bridge between what's urgent and needed right now, and sort of what technology gets developed sort of long term, right? And I think what's unique about the two of us is we can sort of have that conversation and have that judgment about what's needed now and what's sort of needed long term, and how those things are going to kind of gracefully evolve from one into the other. That I think is the heart of the conversation that everyone else is having problems with, right? When you talk about LPAs or you talk about branding or so on, we would say that we're kind of going back to a time, around the Cold War where defense is sort of leading on the tech side. And I think the rest of the world is kind of catching up with that, right? It's, we're now in an era of kind of geopolitical rivalry, and that is what's going to be driving the defense landscape, right? And I think, we're just sort of leading on that wave, and inevitably the rest of it will sort itself out, would be my take on it.
I think Daniel hit on a really important piece there, which is it's not either or. And I think that's the thing that gets a lot of people wrapped around the axle. You get some really well-meaning folks who say, well, we need to get X right now because that is the most immediate problem. And whether it's venture returnable or not, we just need to invest in that. Others who will go, well, this is really a deep tech issue, so let's just focus on the deep tech side of it. And that problem at the end of the day is fundamentally, it's not either or. You need, like most things in venture, a portfolio-based approach. The way Daniel and I look at the world is really around 3 buckets, if you will. Your current unmet needs, so things that, hey, we need to either do now that we're not doing or do better, be at lower cost, more capability. Or the future unmet needs, hey, these are things that we know are coming down the pipeline from a threat perspective or from a technology perspective that we need to get ahead of, but they've been identified. But then there's that third bucket too, which is when Daniel alluded to with his DARPA methodology, which is, hey, these are the unknown unknowns effectively. It is, if these things work, they are going to be transformational in terms of how our society functions, if our society can be resilient and how our warfighter conducts their business or their mission sets. So you can't have one or the other. I think that's actually one of the biggest misnomers out there for even the more nascent, well-meaning defense investors out there who maybe don't have the investment track record, haven't been investing long, is that they just try to focus on that few current unmet needs. But at the same time, you need to prevent that strategic surprise that fundamentally underpins any kind of geopolitical rivalry and future of technology. And so it has to be a portfolio of meeting those current and future needs, but also those transformational ones. And that's why I think our joint approach works so well together, is because I do focus on those two first categories. I know that there's important. I've made investments on that before, but that's been Daniel's bread and butter for now over a decade. And I think marrying these two approaches up results in better capabilities as well as better returns, in my view.
Yeah, and just Andreas, just picking up on that point, from an allocation perspective, asset allocators are looking at like why defense, right? What's surprising or not, Nick's got greater than a 5 times return based on his sort of really urgent type methods. That's ironically, I've got the very same return, right, on this long-term type approach. Some of our Estonian colleagues, they've got sort of, even higher than that, right? So I think collectively we've got this, what might be the best return, track record for defense, particularly in Europe. But what we, aspire to is actually the DARPA record, right? And the NASA record, where they've proven that, you can get 14 times like return across this sort of method of investing. So we think we can do even better.
Tell me, both of you, because you have a thesis where one of the words you use is next gen defense fund. Tell me a bit about that word, unpack the word next gen.
It really stems from some of the internal discussions we've had, but really going back to a paper I actually wrote for the French Air and Space Force a few years ago, really around this concept of next gen defense. What really underpins it, so to speak, is this combination of taking things that are this early stage, we call TRL or technology readiness level, that are more of those transformative capabilities, as well as the newer capabilities, or what are referred to in NATO circles as EDTs, or emerging and disruptive technologies, but pairing those with real-time iteration and feedback from the end user, in this case, the warfighter, and almost on that commercial software type model. Now, it varies from technology and capability to capability, but you're effectively having this feedback flywheel. You're able to set this up and actually iterate on these solutions. And critically, obviously, when I wrote that paper years ago now, that was prior to really the second Russian invasion of Ukraine expanding the way it has. And that's effectively really some of the model that Ukraine has leveraged in order to basically iterate solutions on the battlefield with those near-term unmet needs. But we're just taking it to that next level, which is, yes, those near-term unmet needs, but more importantly, those future unmet needs and those transformative capabilities. At the same time, the other part of this we do talk about is next-gen defense platform. And we really do see this as a platform-based approach. And when I say that, it really is a coalition. I think you've heard me use this term before, Andreas, coalition of the willing, where we're partnering up with some great folks out there from universities and research institutions, with some other larger, more generalist funds out there, but really trying to advance this idea of next-gen defense in context of a new European strategic culture, which, to be quite frank and quite blunt, Europe hasn't really had, one could argue, at least since the end of the Cold War, and if one was being somewhat pejorative, which I would never dream of being, but even since the end of the Second World War.
And just to dive in that in a bit more detail, Andreas, so the U.S. has a large number of institutions do long-term strategic thinking on what will create military advantage, right? There's RAND, there's DARPA, Nick's associated with a couple that I can't talk about. There's a lot of thinking that goes into this. How do we develop technology which is going to give us an advantage, short-term and long-term? When people look at Ukraine, they, I think they instinctively understand it's about new tech, it's about software, and it's about like really close integration with the soldiers on the front line, right? And we sort of zoomed in on that as the thing that's important, right? That's our guiding star. And as Nick said, we're setting up this platform. We take problems from nations. My methodology has always been this DARPA thing. So we've got all the DARPA problems. Nick has problems from other organizations. We then, take those from NATO and all the countries that we associate with, and we're trying to build out this really long-term picture, right? And this is the next gen part of it, right? The problem-driven approach, the strategic-driven approach, right? I think the other part is that Europe's defense ecosystem is evolving, right? In the US, there's a very, clear supply chain and it's almost pyramidal in the sense that, you go up and you get bigger and bigger. That's not really that structure in Europe, right? When we look at what's happening in Ukraine, a war that might be fought in NATO is probably going to be different than will be fought in Ukraine, right? We've got big primes, we've got lots of startups. We think there's this sort of gap in the middle in terms of how that conversation happens between those two and how you fit into this sort of supply chain and this defense sort of ecosystem. And by going down this sort of strategic problem-led approach, right, we're filling that gap in a way that we can talk to both sides, right? And we think that makes the ecosystem a lot better.
Can you tell me a bit about the mission here? And I ask because everything's getting a bit messy, so to say. On the one hand, you used to have a really strong alliance between the parties in the West, the US and Europe. And now it seems like on some parts we do and some parts we don't as much. Today, we're looking at the date is 20th of August. Today we have all of a sudden Germany not wanting to buy weapons from Israel anymore. I have my Danish news feed flooded with people saying that we should not do that in Denmark either. So what is happening to the alliances here? What does that mean for the venture and the startup landscape?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the world, just to be quite blunt and not to put too negative of a thing on this, though I feel like the last podcast I did, I said the exact same thing, Andreas, when it comes to activity, but I'm a realist. At the end of the day, the world, and there's data that brings up from conflicts galore, is the world is getting less safe, not more. There's less willingness in the West to act as a cohesive force, to involve itself in conflicts worldwide, and to be that policeman, wherever you want to think of that as a positive or a negative. The result of that is there are an increasing number of countries and regional conflicts that are arising and will continue to arise. That doesn't just have to be Russia, Ukraine, or Taiwan, China. It also could run the gamut of things like India, Pakistan, short conflict, Thailand, Cambodia, Iran, Israel, Israel and the Palestinian territories. The whole area means that things are becoming more fragmented and more tense, I would say. At the same time, this post-war consensus that we've had within the West, real large, has started to fragment. Now, one could argue this would have happened regardless of who was in the White House in the United States, or what or how Israel would have acted. Some could argue both sides of that. We're not here to make that argument. What we are here to say is the world is getting less safe. It is more fragmented, and as such, Europe, be it however you want to define it, we define this as European Union plus the UK, Switzerland, Norway, and other parts who are on the outside in. Europe needs the ability to act for its own national interests, so to speak. And to do that, it needs its own tech ecosystem, as you have always talked about, but also it needs its own defense ecosystem. That's not to say they shouldn't buy Israeli tech or shouldn't buy US tech. It should buy, by all means, especially for current and immediate needs, you buy what's the best in class to increase deterrence and increase the resiliency of your populace. But what that also means is if in the future you want this capability and you want not just the deterrence, but also all these jobs and investment that have been created in the Israeli or the US ecosystems, then you need to start cultivating your own as well.
How do you think about that, right? Because Andreas, as you mentioned at the very beginning, it's all becoming very, very complicated, right? And for us, we just focus on the frontier. That means the Baltics, Finland, Poland. We think that is going to be, the clearest sort of need that's going to change or could occur within Europe, right? Or Russia attacking one of those things. So we use that in terms of the guiding star, right? And we think that, helps understand where these defense companies should, build value, right? And it means, again, going back to the problem sets, it's very clear in terms of how we prioritize what's needed and what will build value, and how we then go and talk to those MODs and customers to be able to, drive revenue into those companies, et cetera, et cetera. The hope is that, really in a short term, right, in a few years, Russia will look over the border and see like, wow, okay, this Ukraine has had this massive startup ecosystem that is, successfully resisted, the aggression there. And then this is like, we've learned all those lessons, right? We've sort of pointed it at our frontier and said, okay, we've got a different industrial sort of setup. We've taken the best and we've really like doubled down on that and brought as much capital as we could into that, right? And that'll build deterrence. And then, as Nick said, that will bring jobs, right? And then we've got this hopefully self-fulfilling kind of loop that will generate this feedback, which will generate more prosperity and more jobs and, more deterrence. So that's, sort of how we get from the near term to the long term.
When I had Stefan Rohle on the podcast, founder or co-founder of Arx Robotics, one of the conversations that I had with him was around the primacy or the need for people to be defense native if you want to be someone that has any credibility in this space. I spoke to him about it from a founder perspective and a salesman perspective, but I'd love to hear your take on this as investors, because of course the defense conferences happen, or the defense tech investor conferences tend to happen alongside defense and NATO and these types of bigger events in the ecosystem. What's the reception like for investors that are non-defense native?
So on the surface, I'd say at the high level, we firmly believe that you need to have a rising tide lifts all boats approach, where you have specialists, you have generalists, you have CVCs and governments all kind of rowing in the same direction. With that said, I'm going to use an example. I think you and I have talked about this previously, Andreas, but now I used to always say 34th, now up to 36 raised funds in the United States. They either wholly or predominantly do defense. Because they are ahead, some would argue 3, some would say 5 or even 7 years ahead in the US, you can kind of look at that and say, hey, what was the commonality? And that commonality was that for those top quartile funds, they're on their 3rd, 4th, or even some 5th vintages. They are, one of their GPs came from either the special operations or the intelligence fields. That was it. That's the one commonality. And for that, that means that experience really matters. And also having come from the space ecosystem, where I was involved more on the consulting side and the M&A side, and Daniel on the investing side, but also helping productize due to his engineering background, PhD. The same thing that happened in space. So with the 2 nearest markets we look at, space and defense, you really need to have subject matter expertise in there, I view to be a credible early stage investor. As you get to growth, as things become less about potential and less about, hey, it's just this team with a great idea that may pivot, as things become more firmly identified, as you go, hey, are they able to execute on their plan? Have they been able to close these key clients in Series A, Series B? Then that becomes, I think, more open to generalists. But I think having that credibility from the technical side, as well as from actually having been in the building, so to speak, having deployed, having spent time downrange, that is really critical to have credibility as an investor, but also credibility with startups when they're looking for value add. Because I fundamentally don't believe early stage, especially defense tech, but even some other parts of deep tech as well, I would say, you can really have credibility if you don't actually understand the ecosystem from a technical and a day-to-day approach. And I believe you have to add value in that one. Some founders later stage may just be looking for money. That's great. Cash can be commoditized. And I think that's kind of happened to a certain extent now in the United States, especially in later stage defense tech. That's not where the European market is right now. You do need early stage expertise. You need the ability, yes, talk to them and help them understand the markets, but also have experience going, hey, here are the organizations that can write you a check. Here is who you should talk to there. And here are their priorities that we're already aware of, even if they're not broadcasting them publicly yet, to be able to help them navigate that, whether it's engage with clients, whether it's security concerns, whether it's new market entry. I fundamentally believe you need to have that credibility to be a good early stage defense tech investor. And there are good generalists who are coming into this market who I would say know what they don't know. And we're always happy to have those conversations. And I've met great investors from all across the Nordics, the Baltics, as well as even the UK, who just are interested in learning, hey, this is a new area for us. I think the danger you run into is when people treat this as just another new hype cycle and start basically putting out a lot of noise about an area, but not a lot of signal. And I think that can muddy the waters for founders. And that's where I try to hopefully be an asset, whether it's the companies we invest in or even the companies that we don't, but that we're always happy to talk. And I know Daniel seen something very similar on the space hype cycle previously.
It's a great point, Andreas. And it's actually something that industry is worried about, right? The established, defense industry is worried about, like, suddenly there's a ton of noise, right? And they're worried about, there is going to be a bust in certain areas, right? And that's going to harm the rest of the industry. So, that group of stakeholders has that concern. I think founders, what Nick said, founders are going to have to take this sort of critical type approach, right? In terms of thinking who can help. Maybe that's a better way of asking the question, right? And like I can say, I've seen Nick get contracts for guys which are 6 months into building the product, right? They get on exercise where that just he has that level of connectivity, right? Whereas on the space side, I think having seen this sort of path happen once before, this sort of boom in the space ecosystem, and fortunately I was there sort of at the beginning, and had a number of unicorns that got established in that sector. These trends are going to be the same. There are going to be people who are super excited about it. They get in and they invest, and we do need that. We do think this is a really long-term trend, but just defense is the hardest investment type to do, right? Just in terms of contracts take quite a long time. Sometimes the government's telling you one thing and they mean another. You got to be able to read between the lines there, and be able to continue to back the best tech and the best founders, even though the data might look different than what you might see from a SaaS or even another deep tech type business.
Let me ask you a question that's a bit out of the pure defense space realm. Why Estonia and why Superangel? You've just decided to base the fund in Estonia, operate it at least together with the Superangel family there. I'd love to understand that decision and how it impacts the firm.
When I had the opportunity, and I've known the Superangel team for a few years now, as we touched on, and when I had the opportunity, to talk to Velio over the last few years, Velio's the founder and managing partner of Superangel, and it really comes down to that kind of tyranny of geography that I referenced in our last conversation, Andreas, where it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when for a lot of folks who are on that frontier, be it in Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, even Finland, where it is the immediacy and the nearness of the threat. And that's really critical to them. It wasn't where I was talking to some other firms who had approached me who wanted to do dual use, or they wanted to hedge, or maybe it was this or that. It was fundamentally having the ability to work with folks that recognized the threat, that understood the criticality of it, and that were willing to do a defense first thesis. Because while it may sound even more, makes more sense today than it did when you and I first started talking years ago, it's still contrary in a lot of circles, believe it or not, or at least push back on because of a whole slew of concerns, historical, ESG, LPA, as you highlighted. But at the end of the day, this is the focus we wanted to have, and that's why we kind of teamed up with them. And at the same time, you look at the track record that Superangel's been able to build out over the last 2 funds in in Estonia. It's been unparalleled and unmatched on that front. And I love working with them. And the other thing would be remiss not to mention is, Jan, who works with us. He's our senior associate, and he's joining us fully from Superangel. He's been a finance guy his entire career, but also because of Estonian conscription, he's a 10-year Estonian Defense Force reservist, and he brings that nearness of mindset and that mission-backed understanding. And that's what I think you need in a team, as I highlighted in our last answer. So for us, there's the opportunity to work in a frontier market that's right on the border of the threat, to obviously work with a team that I have gotten to know and like over the last few years, and really to be able to get that prioritized at speed to market. I also know, and I'll hand over to Daniel, because he also has some deeply personal reasons there as well that I think are willing to flag.
Yeah. For me, my partner's Estonian. My son's Estonian. That's why it really matters to me. My brother was a deputy commander of Canada's NATO Rapid Reaction Force. We have the responsibility of protecting Latvia. If something happens, my family's personally implicated in a number of different reasons. There's a bunch of logical reasons as well why Estonia. Estonia has been, very much at the forefront of championing, the new defense thing. They've put together, a new defense fund at the national level. They've bought a lot of equipment. They've really supported Ukraine. But I think, historically, what people may not know is Estonia went through this sort of massive, what they call tiger leap, where they digitized the entire society, right, in the 90s. And I don't know of anywhere else in Europe that has been able to kind of go through this sort of massive tech leap, right? And I think now, for me, looking at with my kind of analytic and strategic hat on, Estonia is in this sort of geographic position, but they also have these people who have kind of gone through this again, right? And Velio, who's with Superangel, he was implicated in a lot of that and invested in a lot of the unicorns that come out of that, right? And if I look for, where in Europe would you think about who can kind of execute this jump from, tech to defense tech being the thing which will lead, prosperity. I mean, I'm, biased, obviously. This is my personal connections, but I think, it could be Estonia, right? And we just got to go in there and start to do the hard work about, building that ecosystem and talking about defense of the Baltics and the border, right? It's not just Estonia, it's Finland, it's Latvia, Lithuania, down to Poland and so on. And we think that, this configuration is the right thing to help make that happen.
And one thing, I think Daniel brings up a great point with the tiger leap aspect of Estonia was, yes, some of that digitization happened because they wanted to evolve society and technology, but a lot of the really rapid iteration that came later on, especially on the cybersecurity and identity front, was directly because of cyber attacks and gray zone activities by Russia against Estonia. And so when you look at the threat perspective, they've already been through something like this on the cyber front. Hence why I think they've been really upfront on Estonia at large, and their military and government have been really upfront on addressing this, not just on the cyber front, but now on the potential kinetic front as well.
Now let's do some myth busting, guys. I'm sure there's a bunch that you think people are getting wrong. Let's start with what I probably think is the main one and the biggest one that is giving you some issues, which is, of course, that a lot of people tend to think that defense is maybe just a bubble. Right now, we have a problem in Ukraine. Everyone talks about it. All the VCs see a possibility to grab some AUM. And that is kind of the gist of it. Why is defense more than just a bubble?
Well, I go back, DARPA, I think, has proven for 67 years, right? That if you take, defense problems and find tech that solves those problems, you build prosperity, right? I personally think, kind of Europe's ignored this fastest track to productize advanced technology, which is, imagine what it could do for defense and then help that guide you to build a product. So, I think we've got, 65 plus years of data to prove that one wrong.
Yeah. And at the same time, you look at more near-term trends, a lot of people will say, well, yes, everything started with the second Russian invasion of Ukraine. But you go back to 2014 through 2021 in the lead up to the invasion, dual members of NATO and the European Union, like the Baltics, for instance, actually closed the gap. Yes, still a large gap, but closed the gap in defense spending on the US. So it is part of this longer trend of defense spending and engagement when you go there. And on the basis of that, and as Daniel touched on, missing out on a lot of the technology boom that was driven by things like DARPA, that's a gap that is why this is not just a bubble, why this is more resilient. At the same time, we're staring down the barrel of, effectively, since the end of the Cold War, a lot of tech debt that needs to be addressed, both in terms of, yes, near-term acquisitions, but also fundamental R&D. As we've already shown, Daniel referenced earlier, through things like NASA, things like DARPA, have shown clear return on investment for the taxpayers in those countries, as well as the capability they developed for the military. And then even beyond that, things that have become even commercial products like duct tape, for gosh sakes, where it has had significant impact, generate new jobs, and change just how the world operates, either on the very basic level like duct tape, all the way through things like GPS and the internet, or even Google Maps, where it came from. So they've missed out on this because of those kind of antibodies against defense, for all the reasons we've talked about before, be it historical, ESG, et cetera. And while there is potentially, and I believe we are kind of entering into a hype cycle, there are long-term trends, be it defense spending that was already growing going back to 2014, be it the proven track record of organizations to prevent strategic surprise like DARPA, like NASA, as well as the later organizations like RCO and SCO. And now we have all these things kind of coalescing. So yes, are we in a hype cycle? Yeah, absolutely, we're getting into it. But there's still value behind the market, and there's still a lot of return on investment for both direct investors as well as taxpayers and countries writ large.
Am I right to say, it's just a feeling that I have here, but that maybe contrary to many other spaces where venture have gone into hype cycles, this is truly one of the spaces where specialist expertise and networks will allow you to see more clearly than a lot of the hyped up money that comes in.
Yeah, I would say so, Andreas. I think at the end of the day, you need to understand defense. You really need to have had, I think, to a large extent, lived it and different parts of your career and have that broader network that's engaged there. I think a lot of folks try to put a band-aid over it. They hire a retired general officer or a former retired minister and think that that'll help them understand it. And that can be helpful. But at the end of the day, there's no substitute for actually having lived experience, I think, and having the personal and professional networks that you've kind of gained by being in the ecosystem. And that's really what I think a lot of early stage founders look for, particularly those who may not have had that experience themselves and need that value add in there. And to a larger extent, also, I mean, I've said this before, but if as this hype cycle progresses and other funds move on to the next shiny object, the ones who were doing 18, 24 months ago, NFTs or crypto, we're still going to be here, as we do believe this is a long-term enduring market for, yes, the defense sector, but also boosting that prosperity and this new economy for pan-European countries, but specifically across those we call the Jeff Plus countries, as we talked about previously, the Baltics, Nordics, and the UK, that can really be a whole new ecosystem and generate new technologies, and as a result, new opportunities for their populaces and their own defense.
Tell me, what else are people getting wrong? What's on your top list of things you wish you could get out of the ecosystem really quick?
I think one of the biggest ones, if I start with probably my most contrarian or controversial one, but I do think it's a conversation we need to have, and for a lot of folks, it's been almost a third rail, is we need to take the right lessons from Ukraine, not all of the lessons. So Ukraine has gone from 0 to 100 in terms of being able to resist a much larger nation with a lot more mass and people to bring to the fight. With that said, there are a lot of reasons it had to leverage the ecosystem it has so far, like some decentralization, for instance. So how their procurement system worked, they had to decentralize it because a lot of their initial ecosystem is effectively paralyzed at the more state level. So what that has done is allowed them to move more nimbly, but at the same time, it's also resulted in a very fragmented ecosystem. We have a lot of duplication of effort and a loss of economies of scale, and just generally some lack of interoperability, which normally you would only see with multinational forces working together, that you see happening there. And what that's resulted in is this really aggressive, heterogeneous mix of technologies, be it from different countries, different solutions, different operating systems, that doesn't always integrate together. And when we look at how another conflict could look like, we actually need more interoperability, not less. So having that from inception, which Ukraine did not have the luxury of being able to do, but we need to actually bake that in from the start. And I think the biggest takeaway for me really is a lot of what Ukraine has had to do have been essential stopgaps. So basically life-saving adaptions. Hey, how do we survive the day? How do we, stabilize our forces? But as a method for long-term competition, for what we call great power competition or a multipolar world, however you want to define it, basically competition with Russia and with China, you need to have, or that approach really lacks the necessary coherence and backbone that you need for long-term enduring effectiveness. And so at the end of the day, yes, there are a lot of really critical lessons we need to take from Ukraine, especially how quickly they've been able to iterate, field new systems, and adapt to changing realities. At the same time, we also need to take advantage of the innate advantages Western economies have, be it in NATO countries or in Eastern and Western Europe, or even the US and Canada, but also bring those to bear in mobilizing a much broader and deeper defense industrial base.
How about a learning that I've heard from some, which is we show up with our super tested, super safe systems developed in the Western world, and we show up at the front line in Ukraine, and the first thing they say is, what's that thing for? And then it's, well, that's to make sure that it doesn't run someone over. And then they're like, well, it's making it more heavy. Get that shit off. We got to get to the front line. Or it makes it imperative that we have connection to it all the time. And for that reason, blah, blah, blah. And it's really a safety mechanism because it's required in the Western world or in the systems that we have kind of developed here. A learning is then, okay, we don't need that anymore. But is that something that is true for the future when you actually go to future battlefields?
Yeah, and I think it depends on what the future conflict is going to look like, because a future conflict of Russia with NATO will have some similarities, but a lot of differences with how the Russia-Ukraine war has been going on, and a fight between potentially the West, be it the US or otherwise, with China in the South China Seas. That is going to be a very different fight entirely. I think too many people get dragged into this. It's either tons of drones that are just going to be disposable and that's it, just full return of mass to the battlefield, which is part of it, or those who still say, hey, we need all these multi-mission, we call bespoke assets, so high cost, years of development time, but very capable and very exquisite. And my answer is you need both. And I'm one in either of these future conflicts, and you need those that are enabling. So things like collaborative combat aircraft or having drones that are enabled by a mothership type approach. There are a whole slew of these technologies we can run down. And to your point, we do need to get back to, I think, first principles when you look at power to weight ratios, when you look at what the different systems for safety and otherwise they're on there. And we have seen a lot of Western equipment, including some of the darlings of the US defense tech ecosystem, under or outright not perform in Ukraine. But at the same time, you also need to make sure that those future systems take the right lessons from Ukraine, but are also optimized for those future conflicts and not just the current conflict. One thing that's been common, doesn't matter the Cold War, the global war on terror, or into great power competition now, Western militaries have a long track record of preparing for the previous conflict, not the future conflict. And that's really what I would want to foot stomp, which is we need to identify those right lessons, but not take all the lessons just because they work there, because the things are, as Ukraine has proven, things evolve on a weekly, if not daily basis. So we have to prepare and bake in those right structures from now so that we're able to do that. Because right now, as we're currently constituted, while we've taken some lessons, European and Western militaries at large are not prepared to do that.
Awesome, Nick. So we really don't want to learn those or draw those wrong lessons. Any other myths that we need to keep in mind?
We covered the myth of defense as a bubble. Hopefully we've comprehensively put that one to bed. I think there's the myth of it takes a really long time to get the product. That isn't the case, as we've seen in Ukraine. If you have the right technology at the right time and there's real urgency, the US particularly has rapid contracting type capabilities, and Europe is developing those as well. And so, we've seen companies, even with just a few people, get up to contracts and revenue pretty quickly. I think that there's another myth around, what sort of systems can be built by startups. And I would say it's almost all to play for, right? Like, we've seen startups develop, space rockets, and, 10 years ago, people say, oh, you're never going to compete with like Lockheed or so on, right? Even now I've seen, when I was in Kiev in September, I saw people who were trying to develop stealth aircraft, right? On the UAV type level. And, I bet that's another thing that people would have said, oh, you could never develop a stealth aircraft as a startup. So even, I think the entire kind of tech landscape is up for grabs.
How about venture versus public markets? We've really seen public equities like Rheinmetall and BAE Systems kind of soaring these days, but why is it interesting to also be looking to the early stages?
Well, I think it's true they have been soaring, right? And rightly so. But you have to remember, most of the primes have a sales pipeline which is like 10 years long. So they have customers that they need to deliver to. And it is true that, those contracts are probably going to increase, et cetera, et cetera. But in terms of the real change in technology, I would argue that that's going to happen in startup land, right? All of the sort of really recent trends are going to be delivered on by startups. So if you want to access, the really, really high growth, which people see happening in defense, it's probably going to happen in startups right now. I mean, what's great from our perspective is that on the prime side, they have a lot of cash, right? So, at some point they'll be looking to acquire. And that's great for us.
Let me ask you a bit about the incumbents. How should we think about them? Are they good for us in the startup land, or are they more of a blocker and someone who are working very effectively on blocking new startups coming into their space?
Really, I think the answer is, as always, it depends. So primes, meaning companies, just like capital P primes, I guess, cover all 5 warfighting domains or contracts across all of those. And you also have the European flavor of national champions. Those are wholly or partly owned by the respective governments. And so they vary in terms of how they interact or with SMEs, so small and medium-sized enterprises, or indeed startups and scale-ups. With that said, the idea that a company can avoid working with them is nonsensical and also not desirable. I think too many folks who are new to the defense market, and I've seen some of this out there on social media or otherwise at some more tech-oriented conferences, will lambast these primes and say they're dinosaurs. They need to shuffle off this mortal coil, if you will, and startups are going to eat everything. Not only would that be a massively missed opportunity, that would cripple Europe and any country's defense industrial base. You need collaboration. And what that means is in the startup's life cycle, you do want to eventually get to a point where you're working directly with government or military customers rather than through pass-throughs. But your fastest route in a lot of cases, especially early on, is working either through or with large contractors, such as the primes and national champions, or even other SMEs. And so when you're looking at that ecosystem, it has to be a collaborative approach. Now, some primes or national champions are more collaborative than others. Some can be fairly usury. Others can be quite great partners, as I've seen through a number in our portfolio, as well as throughout my own career. We do need to do a better job of incentivizing them to work more and on a more friendly basis with the startups. But by the same token, the ecosystem needs both. You look at a company you mentioned earlier, like Rheinmetall. Rheinmetall, I think right now, as ballpark, has somewhere around a 5 to 7 year backlog where they could just deliver on that and not have to do anything new. And so they really do need to meet those unmet needs or those things that, hey, we need these systems right now. At the same time, a lot of European governments, and this was most recently recognized both by Estonia in their recent announcements, as well as in the Strategic Defense Review in the United Kingdom, they need to spend more on R&D to develop those key future capabilities. And companies like Rheinmetall and others don't have the resources, bandwidth, or time to be doing a lot of these bigger swings, so to speak. And so that's why you need startups and scale-ups in this ecosystem to do both. Address those key gaps from the last decades of underinvestment from the big so the primes can get after that and those big systems, but also these startups to develop the broader ecosystems and transformational capabilities.
Nick, I'm asking you again because unfortunately Daniel is being the target of a cybersecurity attack to block his connection to be able to get out his important messaging. So we'll end this episode just with you and I'll ask you this question, which is, what do you think are the biggest risks executing a strategy like yours?
The biggest risks, if you're looking at Europe as a whole and doing defense, is what happens. I think as any good investor, you have to go, what happens if the war in Ukraine ends tomorrow? There are a few different ways, and we can break down the scenarios at another time, or happy to do it here now. But you have to imagine what happens then. Or if there's a stalemate, we end up with a temporary peace. And at the end of the day, the risk you have is, I talked earlier about the tyranny of geography. And I think for some Western, Southern European countries, as some have even shown through their unwillingness to make certain investments already, the farther you away from the conflict, the less immediate or less existential it is to you. So you're more willing to probably ramp down or go to the nearest crisis of the moment. And so not dedicate enough resources or long-term resources to investing in defense. And if you're sitting in certain parts of Western and Southern Europe, I think that's a very real concern. That's also one of the reasons that we chose to focus on the JEF, or the Joint Expeditionary Force countries that I talked about at the start, the Nordics, the Baltics, the UK, and Poland, is because these countries have that nearness of the threat. They have the historical reasons to support there, as well as in the cases of working together, I would say in a much more enhanced interoperable fashion, that they, go back to even the start of the war, even look at the UK, has been the biggest backer of Ukraine since the outbreak of the conflict. And so these countries are much less likely to have that, U-turn kind of mindset in the case of something ending. And that's why we focus on them. But if you were, say, focusing as a pan-European investor, but focused on other markets, I would say, do you fundamentally believe that this market is going to have the willingness and the ability to continue on afterwards? And I think that varies. It's the old Henry Kissingerism. What do I call Uncle Europe? It depends on what capital you're in.
Beautiful, gentlemen. I am so happy that we did this episode together. I'm so happy that you're now live with Archangel. I think you'll do incredible things for our ecosystem and our safety. So, gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you very much, Andreas.
Thanks, Andreas.
And as everyone heard, Daniel ended up being able to get through his firewall of problems, but he is here, hopefully unscathed by the cybersecurity attacks on him. So thank you everyone for tuning in today, and thank you guys for joining me on the pod. Before we start the show, a quick note. If you're building or running a fund, you know it takes the right partners. At EUVC, we only work with sponsors we truly believe should be part of your tech stack. Please do take a moment to hear about them. And if you do, reach out, mention EUVC. It's the best way you can support what we do. Thank you so much. First up, ACE Alternatives. Every fund manager needs clean operations behind the scenes. From fund admin to tax and compliance, ACE handles it all across VC, PE, private debt, and real assets. They're trusted by some of the best investors in the world, and if you want peace of mind and a scale-ready back office, ACE should be part of your stack. Finding deals and managing your portfolio is at the heart of running a fund. Synaptic helps you discover startups before others do, and Portfolio IQ keeps your portfolio data sharp and ready for LPs. Together, they're essential tools for modern fund managers. When it comes to legal, you need a team that truly knows venture. Haynes Boom supports LPs, GPs, startups, and scale-ups across the full fund lifecycle. Smart managers make Haynes Boom part of their stack. We have two at EUVC. Tech Barbecue. Oh my God, who doesn't love barbecue? Europe's startup scene meets the loudest, friendliest family reunion ever at Tech Barbecue. From Nordic founders to global VCs, this is where ideas catch fire and relationships get real. If you're building or backing in Europe, Tech Barbecue is where you want to show up. And hey, if you've got a big fund announcement coming up, want to hit the headlines, or just want to tell your story out, do reach out to us because we'd love to help. And we've got some killer partners to help you get in the right media places. They've helped us land Bloomberg, CNBC, Financial Times, Forbes, and many more for the EUVC Summit, and we'd love to do the same for you.
This was their finest hour.
Tear down this wall.
It's more than just an alliance. This is a union of values.
Let's start acting.